welcome to Inside the Rookery Season 7, the last episode of the season. And as it is Pride Month, and you may have watched our episode last week where Trip was one of the panel. You may not, because we had real sound problems, so we've had to take it down, and then we're going to clean it up, possibly, and reload it up. So if you saw us last week, you'll already have met Trip. If you didn't, then Trip will be as new to you as Chris is, C.L. McCartney, who also joins us tonight. So what are we talking about tonight? Well, Chris and Trip are 2/3 of the minds behind Bona Books, a queer small press based in London that specialises in science fiction, fantasy and horror. So today we're going to be casting our beady eyes over world building as an act of social justice. Those of you who've been on many of our streams before will know that that's hugely important to us at the Rookery when we build our own worlds. And we want to talk about designing worlds that are deliberately, radically inclusive and all that means. So you'll see Chris has joined us. So Chris is a writer and editor of fantastic fiction, expanding recently, somewhat to his surprise, into queer cosmic horror. His next short story can be found in the forthcoming anthology, The Crawling Moon. Welcome to the stream. And below me, you'll see Trip. Trip is a recovering academic, possibly has the best name I've ever encountered in my life, and author of fantasy, whose debut novel, A Mark of Dreams and Destiny, has recently been shortlisted for the Mythopoeic Awards, and perhaps more impressively, has incredibly high praise from one of the other Rooks, Andy Leask, who's really hard to please as he's a head of English and teaches fiction and prose and leads a cadre of other people teaching it. And he has wanted me to say that he has started it. He's, funnily enough, Trip, as your tagline implies, 1/3 of the way through it. And he says it is absolutely brilliant. So please do go out and buy it.
Well, thank you.
No problem at all. So, welcome to the stream. Would you like to introduce Bona Books or your work or anything before we get into the pre-submitted questions?
Sounds great. Chris, do you want to introduce Bona Books, or do you want to introduce the anthology?
Well, you've got a whole book to talk about, so I'll talk about Bona Books and the anthology. So basically, Trip and Robert, who's the other third, and I all used to live together, and we were sitting around our kitchen table one day and came up almost as a joke with what we thought was a great name for an anthology, and I imagine we'll get into that later. And we suddenly went, oh, we have all the skills to do this, don't we? We should probably make this happen. And it was almost kind of like, we can, so we should. And so all of this stuff, this kind of crazy last year or so, has all fallen out of us having a weird idea around the kitchen table. It's like, oh, well, we want to do an anthology. Oh, well, we kind of need to have a publishing house, though. Oh, if we do one anthology, we'll probably need to do another. And it's been a bit of a whirlwind. It's been incredibly good fun. But yes, so Bona Books, for those not in the know, Bona is a term from Polari, which is a kind of queer. It was used by sort of gay men, but also in the theatre, particularly in Britain, in sort of mid 20th century, as a kind of like sort of secret language that allowed gay people to talk about gay things without anyone else cottoning on. And there's a very famous set of radio sketches with characters called Julian and Sandy, where everything was Bona something, Bona this, Bona that. And Bona just means like good. It's like, so Bona Books, good books, but more importantly, queer books. And so we've set up this little publishing house. And currently we're producing the one book. There's the one anthology, and we're hoping that there are many more anthologies and exciting projects to come. But so the first thing that's going to come off the production line in the next month or two is an anthology of 17 pulp science fiction and fantasy stories starring LGBT protagonists called I Want That Twink Obliterated.
Thank you. And Trip, do you want to give a little intro to yourself and the book? I've shared the links, so I've shared the links for Bona Books in the chat, and I've shared a link to your book in the chat, so you can check both of those things out, everyone.
Yep. Please do. We are taking. We're open for pre-orders for I Want That Twink Obliterated before we start fulfillment, because it was originally a Kickstarter. But you can still nip in and get not only an ebook or a paperback, but we are producing a full audiobook, which is incredibly exciting. We haven't fully got into that yet, but we hope to use own voices for the production of the audiobook as well. But yeah, no, I'm Trip Gailey. I have a ridiculous doctorate in studying goblin markets, which, funnily enough, my book is set at a goblin market. Oh, how does that work? Yeah. So, recovering academic, emphasis on the recovering, because it has been exhausting these last few years. Yeah, I write fantastical, weird stuff with queer protagonists, just always queer protagonists, because, I can never get this quote right. If the book that you want to read doesn't exist, you're obliged to write it yourself. I know a very prominent author said something much better than that, but that words to that effect. So, yeah, we need more queer books in the world. I want to read more queer heroes from all across the spectrum. So that's part of why I hang out with this guy over here, and we do shenanigans like produce anthologies. But yes, I'm also the author of A Market of Dreams and Destiny, set in an alternate Victorian world with magic and a fairy market beneath London, where you can buy and sell quite literally anything, including destiny, fate, true love, as long as you can pay the price. That's always the catch, isn't it? Having enough to pay. But it's shenanigans, it's fairy bargains, it is two young queer men in love trying to figure stuff out, and yeah, craziness ensues.
It sounds brilliant, and I am looking forward to reading it as well. So let's get into the pre-submitted questions, but as always, if you have any comments or questions, pop them in the chat. Suedjin, recovering academic, finds that quite amusing. Have you not yet recovered, Suedjin? Are you...
If it's anything like my experience, it takes a while. The shell shock is extreme, and it runs deep.
So Kilishandra asks, queer is often equated with camp, over the top, or very gay. Do you prefer to steer into or away from this stereotype?
So I'm just going to jump right in here, because the answer is, for me, both, either, whatever. As a writer, just look at the cover of A Market of Dreams and Destiny. I am a more is more kind of writer. I love ornate language. I love me a metaphor. And I feel that camp and over-the-top, larger-than-life-ness, as an aspect of both queer identity and an aspect of the fantastic, which includes both science fiction and fantasy and horror within sort of that umbrella term. Some of those things actually require you to reach larger than life. If Ernest Hemingway could never in his entire life write a drag queen. I'm sorry, if you are trying to portray a drag queen on the page, which is already quite a challenge, you need to go over the top. You need to embrace the camp. You need to embrace the drama and the excess. I'm sorry, if you go up to any drag queen, working drag queen, pretty much anywhere in the world, and you call her dress red, no, you are going to get red for filth, because no, that is crimson, that is scarlet, that is magenta. Red is just red. There are some parts of the queer experience, not all parts of the queer experience, obviously, but there are some parts of the queer experience that inherently do. They vibrate with camp. They are made more by embracing that extra. Just my opinion, but like sometimes you do need more to be more.
What about you?
I mean, ditto to all of that. I think one thing I'd also say is that where, like, in the question they said very gay, and what I think is often overlooked in a way is that people talk about queer stories or LGBT books purely in terms of representations. Like, okay, yeah, there's a gay character in it, so that counts. There's a lesbian couple in it, that counts. Which is true. Representation is really important. I love that all those books exist. But I would say you can absolutely tell when there's a story that's got standard mainstream concerns that has gay characters in it or LGBT characters in it, and a story that is sort of fundamentally queer, that has queer concerns, queer themes, a queer attitude to life running through it. And that can almost be abstract sometimes, quite abstract sometimes. Like queer stories are often about, tearing down systems, say, because historically LGBT people are oppressed and the systems don't help them, So, like, an LGBT approach to fantasy might not be all about, oh, let's restore the king because we have to get back to how things used to be because that was better. That's often, I'm sure there are ways to do it, like that's not a queer reading of fantasy, So in the sense that, like, queer is like really gay, like, yes, because I think like what we're trying to do is making sure that like that queerness is running through the stories like a stick of rock. It's there's a centrality to it. Sorry, that's a more kind of like earnest response than Trips, but yeah, I think that's another way into it, which I like think is really important as well.
Yeah,
this is why I bring him along. Like he brings all the sensibleness and he balances out my rabid squirrel enthusiasm.
We thought deeply about that when we were Andy Law, Andy Leask, when we were working on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition, Wifrip 4. And because Wifrip has the chaos gods in them, and so the idea of like change and being different can be perceived to be bad. We worked really, really hard to actually think about that world in a different way. So in that world, they have an aether, which is all things, which means gods who exist in the aether are neither male nor female. They're not constrained by the binary of the reality of which humans live in. And I worked with some trans friends of mine and I'm queer myself, and a number of us were involved who were, and really thought about like, well, how would you make that so it's actually quite a special feature of that world, that although there's a goddess Shalia who's a goddess of mercy and perceived to be, those something humans lay on her, she could manifest in any way, they could manifest in any way. And I tried to write the section that I wrote about the gods really in a non-binary way, and I gave it to my friends for feedback, and they were like, no, it's not non-binary enough yet. And I really thought that I had really like stripped away the binary, but like it was really important to hear from people who were immersed in that every day of their lives, to think about what kind of words they wanted to read to feel more connected to the world that we were, in this case, not creating because it's Games Workshop's property, but certainly influencing in our own small way to try to be more inclusive for people. There was some backlash and some praise.
You shock me.
Yeah.
But that is incredibly true. Like we are often raised in and grow up in a world that is incredibly heteronormative, and those sorts of defaults, they can sink very, very deep, and it's not always completely obvious, because something as innocuous as like a color choice. Like,
Yeah.
why did you put that cis male hero in blue? Why did you choose blue, and why did you not choose pink? Like,
Mm-hmm.
or even yellow? Like, why is he in a solid dark primary color?
Mm-hmm.
Those sorts of associations, they can really creep in. They can creep in quite often in terms of how relationships are recreated. Often, bottoms, for example, are associated with like femininity and being passive and given more classically feminine traits, while tops are like given the more like, oh, they're not in touch with their emotions and they're more buttoned down and they always have to be the strong stalwart one projecting. And like, that is not how a lot of queer relationships work. Like a key part of being a queer person, in any kind of relationship, is that you are negotiating your reality within the basis of how you interact with other people, and it does not necessarily completely map onto the traditional gender roles and the traditional models that many of us were raised with.
Mm-hmm. And I remember Andy Law was writing a villain in an adventure that he was doing for Wifrip, and he was like, I quite like this. Like, I wanted to introduce more, in this case, sexuality diversity, but had said to B, Andy, who was Andy's kind of writing partner at the time, and B is I think pansexual. I'm not sure. I maybe have got that wrong. So sorry if they're watching and I've mislabeled you, but they're certainly not a straight white man. They are not that at all. And B had said, like, to Andy, because Andy was like, I don't want to make a villain like and make them gay, and B was like, yeah, but that's fine. Like, as long as the sexuality is kind of just like a side point. It's not why they're a villain, it's not what they're a villain about, it is just a facet of their character. Like, you're right, then that's okay. And Andy was like really trepidatious about it, because he was trepidatious as someone who he felt was in a place of privilege about doing it. The end result, if B hadn't like supported that decision, would have actually been less representation, not more, because he was worried about like falling into some of these stereotypes by accident.
Yeah,
Oh, here,
and it takes a, like, so many of these things are like they're difficult in aggregate. Like, you can't point at an individual. Like, one of the issues I find sometimes with online discourse is that like a gay character dies and somebody goes, bury your gays. I've read TV tropes. That's a cliche. It's a bad thing. And it's like, well, it can't be the case that we can't ever kill gay characters. Like, that would be terrible. That would rob gay stories or queer stories of like all the drama and diversity of human emotion that all the straight people have. Like, obviously this has to exist, but yes, the flip side of that is that if you consume a lot of queer media, LGBTQIA plus media, then like trends emerge. You watch your 12th film where where the one gay character in the story dies, and you're like, oh,
yeah,
again, and that's where like own voices become so important, because you do it's really hard to have that perspective unless you're talking to people, and unless you're involving them, unless you read the art that they produce. And that kind of applies to any representation, I think.
I was watching something recently, but now it's totally escaped my mind what it was, but something like that happened and I was absolutely furious. It was like pure rage. So full of rage, in fact, that I've completely blanked that piece of media from my mind, apparently. So Disconomicon says, queer Marxism, queer anarcho-communism, be gay, do crime is from the Mary Nardini gang, who were queer anarchists. So which queer are we talking about? I guess every person's queer is different, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I use this in a very unconsidered way, in that it was. I mean, in fact, I grew up in sort of the era and location where like gay was the byword for crap, for shit.
Yeah, the
like,
go-to insult.
it,
Yeah, me
it
too.
was the go, you know, that was like the entirety of my childhood was like, oh, we have to go out play rugby and it's raining. Oh, it's so gay. You know, and so and queer in a very instinctive way for me is a term that gets used in a sort of very empowering, reclaimed, umbrella-y sort of a way. It refers to the community in general. I mean, you can get into all sorts of conversations about whether it means different things to different people. But the way it tends to be used these days, and what I like about it is that it feels like there's a strength in it as a reclaimed slur, but also it feels like it's got a breadth to it these days in how it's used, and you don't have to, you know, you don't have to sort of specify down. I'm talking about you specifically, and you specifically, and you specifically. You can sort of there's a slight vagueness to it, which means that everyone's welcome.
Yeah. That's how I
Also,
felt the word. Sorry, Trip. When you...
Also, like, sorry, this is where the recovering academic comes in, because I'm like, as soon as any of these sorts of discussions come up, my brain immediately goes, okay, we need to define our terms, because queer does have a lot of meanings. It has a very sort of like specific sort of like umbrella meaning, the general sense that Chris was talking about, where it extends to cover sort of like the entirety of those sort of groups that shelter under the LGBTQIA plus canopy. But also, like, queer has a very specific meaning as well in like the academic community, where queer theory exists, and that is more talking about queer as the exception to the norm and how those
which is what
constructs work.
Put in the comments just now. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So like as soon as this debate comes up, it's like, it's define your terms. Like gay as well. Like a lot of people will use gay as an umbrella term for the entire community, whereas other people are quite firm in that, no, we like to only apply gay to like male men in male relationships, or who have same-sex attraction. So a lot, words are fuzzy, language is fuzzy, communication is fuzzy. So it's sort of like define your terms, be aware of the fact that this is fuzzy and this is not always going to be perfect. Academic rant over.
Having received the Foucault definition, and apologize, I'm not as widely read as I should be, I would endorse that definition.
Okay, so Seagoat asks, how do you show that your worlds are inclusive to queer and other marginalized groups? And it follows on, I just couldn't fit it all in. Do you just write this as the norm in that world, or do you go out of your way to show bigoted attitudes have no place in your world?
So this is sort of like a complex thing to address. Because if you do have a world in which queerness is completely accepted and is not the norm, those bigoted examples are going to be hard to find, because they won't really exist to show. I personally feel that there are purposes for both kinds of approach, and different needs that they're approaching, and different sort of like storytelling models that fit better or worse with each of them. But generally speaking, if you are attempting to write or design a queer inclusive world, I'm going to completely ignore the debate as to whether or not, if your world is queer inclusive, if it's even queer, because that goes back into like the whole like, what's our definition? Like being queer is ostensibly partially just because queer people do not fit the norm. But if you're in a queer norm world, does that or does that not erase your queerness? That is a huge thorny philosophical debate that I'm not going to get into. But if we're talking about like establishing, okay, we have a world and we have readers that are entering into this created, this built existence, where same-sex attraction is a normal and accepted part of society, either now and it hasn't been in the past, or it has been throughout the entirety of history. Those things are different, and they will require different background writing technique markers. But yes, anyway, it's you show that in the small moments is one way you can do it. You can show, like in my book, to bring it around there, in one of the early chapters, it's a marketplace chapter. You have a lot of people out in the background, and one of the things that the main character encounters is two men essentially ordering flowers for their wedding. And it's just presented as a completely normal thing. There's no adverse reaction to it in the background, and the character reactions to these moments of what to your reader would be quite obvious queerness signal, oh, this is okay here. And maybe you need to repeat this a few times to spread it across to get the thrust that, oh, this is the general, this is the norm across the entire world. This is just how it is. But yeah, one way you can do it is just weaving it in those little touches in the background. I'm going to let Chris talk because that was a lot.
Yeah. Well, so I have thoughts, and I feel like I'm maybe going to come at the question slightly sideways. That because the thought that provoked in me is that I think a lot for how I would be approaching that, I either as a writer or an editor, would be I'd be thinking about audience, because like you could have exactly the same world, and you could express it in either way. You could have, like, it is generally accepted in this society that queer people are fine, and there is some bigotry around, and you could either show it as the norm, or you could, and I think either of those is entirely legitimate. You can just, as Tripp says, you can just have some representation out there, or you can have some representation and somebody being prejudiced and that person being shot down. But what that the biggest impact in my head that has is sort of that if it's just presented as the norm, queer people will spot that, and it's almost this is like a safe space of a world. Like, this is a world where characters are being themselves and they just exist and nobody's commenting on it. If there is bigotry, even if it's being shot down, there's a kind of like, oh, this is a slightly less of a safe space. This is a world where this question is still it's a live debate, as it were. And I might almost say that feels more appropriate to me. Sorry, and this is not me talking like, this will not always be true, but say, like, if you're trying to make a point, if your work is slightly more proselytizing, if it's going to have a broader audience, you're like, no, I'm making a point about, like, the acceptance of X group, then showing that conflict and teasing it out on the page, that's the sort of, it's almost more a question about what are you talking about, what are you trying to show. And certainly if I was trying to write a sort of really lovely inclusive world that, like, this is like a warm hug to, like, everyone, including LGBT readers, and they can just come in, and this is a utopia where none of these issues are a problem, then, like, don't have somebody pop up being bigoted and being slapped down, because it's like, no, why is your bigotry encroaching on my lovely warm hug? Well, so in a way, it's like it is a world building question, but I think it's almost like it's how you're showing that world off and how you're inviting people into that world, if that makes sense. That's a bit rambly, but.
Well, it's interesting because there's a question in the chat that you've almost answered there without knowing that this question was about to come up. And that is, how do you write anti-bigotry without falling into the trap of becoming that which you, and Disconomican corrects, that which you hate. So that which you hate, bigots. And you kind of touched on it there, that that you don't have bigots popping up and being slapped down and made to feel stupid and small for their views. Instead, you simply have a world in which people can exist, and you drop their ordering flowers, you know, she's going home to her wife and at home without having to create an opposition in that world. But is there other ways to do it? Like, have I interpreted what you were saying correctly there?
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm a massive fan of using genre fiction to talk about issues, and to wrestle with difficult things, and like there's a part of me that goes, well, in a way, I want to strongman the enemy. Like, if you're going to have a story with bigotry in, if you want to tackle it, write the best bloody version of a bigot that you can, and then have that founder, like, tease it out. You know, don't make them look stupid. Try and make them as the best good faith version of their argument, and then bloody well destroy it. That's kind of my attitude to that. But that's a very specific thing to do. Only certain people will want to read it. And you may not be creating, you know, that's not a thing to do in your cozy fantasy novel, for instance.
A lot of fantasy novels, though, they well, whether they have bigotry that is related to real world bigotry, like skin color, like sexuality, etc., whether they have that or not, and a lot of them do not have that, but they do introduce their own, like, bigotry. So a class of people like wizards is hugely common, and then you can explore bigotry as a concept and show how bigotry is often based in ignorance, in fear, in prejudice, in stereotypes, in a way that means, Disconomican, you're not taking aim at people in the real world who may have a bigoted view because they grew up and were taught that way. And I think that's an interesting way to showcase and discuss bigotry, like, in a fantasy novel. But it doesn't necessarily, that doesn't have to be a queer novel in which that happens to be able to do that.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true. And indeed, I was on a panel a convention last year, I think, and I sort of found myself stumbling onto the realization that I think one of the reasons I really loved fantasy as a kid is that one of the kind of some of the foundational archetypes of fantasy revolve around the kid who grows up feeling a bit different, and there's something about him that means he can't take part in the normative society, and he has to run away from it and find a different kind of a family and people who are like, and I sort of had this like brain exploding moment of like, oh, there's you could totally read a load of all of these classic fantasies as queer narratives, and they weren't intended as that, but that reading absolutely exists. Yeah, I think there is I forget what, I think this is an old like Tolkien C.S. Lewis argument, but there is an issue in fantasy between like allegory and illusion, that you can turn the conflict into a metaphor, but there is also then the risk that you turn the conflict into such a direct metaphor. There's like, oh, you're talking about the Holocaust, aren't you? And at that point, you
might as well write a book about the Holocaust.
Yeah, and you're not actually making things easier on yourself by abstracting it, because you've made the parallel so direct that everyone and their dog is just reading the story and going, actually, you're just talking about race. And, you know, so it's kind of, there is an interesting line there.
Yeah, that is interesting. Maddie's got a question. I feel like I'm really being stretched tonight. I wish Andy Leask was here, because he would love to talk about illusion and allegory and various things like that. So Maddie Holmes asks, when does the political and public-private identities become apolitical? We'll look to the recovering academic for this one, Chris. Look, he's thinking deeply about it.
So like that's the sort of question where it's like, does it ever become apolitical?
Mhm.
Because even if you make the argument that like the certain centrists are quite often fond of making is like, oh, I'm just engaging with this academically, or I'm just talking about the ideas or what I like. It's never just an idea. It's always someone's life. And even and like we have seen that like even if you are occupying the privileged position and generally you do not have to engage with your skin tone or your dominant sexuality or whatever your privileged normative default identity is, even if you don't have to think about the same sort of things that the marginalized do, you are still affected by the system or whatever it is that places you in that position of privilege, and quite often you are affected in a negative way. If you want a direct example of this, like the thing that a lot of people are talking about now is the epidemic of loneliness amongst straight men. That's an epidemic because the systems that are being used to target, marginalize, and oppress queer people are the same systems that are pushing straight men into not having any kind of warm, caring, supportive, interactive relationship with their fellow straight men. We all exist in the water. Just because we're fish and we don't realize that we're in the water, it's still around us. I'm not persuaded that you can ever become fully apolitical because existence is political. People having more access to resources, capitalism, just how political choices are having a direct, extreme, and monumental impact on the climate around us. Like everything is connected, it is all interwoven. It is very hard to extract yourself and go to a place that is actually just not touched by politics.
I
There was an
really.
article.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry. No,
Yeah,
you go.
there's an article somewhere that I used as part of my dissertation, and the author talks about how all world building, without exception, is political. Even if you choose to completely replicate the world that we are in,
Mm-hmm.
just because you want to tell a story about the world we're in, that's an explicitly political choice. You are choosing to take the world we're in with all of its problems and replicate those problems across into a whole new universe of your own creation. It is very, very hard to reach a state of true apoliticalness.
I'm really glad you used the example of epidemic of loneliness, and we've talked a bit in a few streams about male mental health and how and a lot of the I've done a lot of work with women's networks, but laterally broadened them out into gender networks in my day job in banking, and we've talked a lot about the flip side of, oh well, it's not fair that a woman gets X, and often when you turn that round, the reason the woman gets X, in this case the one who has to take the maternity leave, is because it's related to a feminine gender stereotype, that when a man expresses a desire to do that, he then comes up against a barrier because he's viewed as, well, you're not really a proper man then. You know, my own husband was the stay-at-home house dad, and he was in the newspaper for it. My oldest is like 20, so it was quite a while ago. But people would regularly stop him in the street, like mostly older women, and be like, he would carry the baby in a papoose, and be like, why doesn't she have shoes on? Like, and then would come and talk to me about his ability to care for the baby. Well, like, it's going to be difficult for you to take a full part of family life if at every turn you're treated like you're weird for taking a full part of family life. So I'm really glad you used that metaphor, because it's one I feel example I feel very strongly about personally. And yeah, and in our
I
world
don't know if that really
building.
answered the question that was given, but I mean,
Oh,
hopefully that was useful to you.
I think that's a really good point, that they don't. You're always making a political choice, even if you choose to replicate and write the status quo. That's a choice. It's not apolitical to do that. It's political. It's an absence of choice is still a choice.
Yeah, I think I would go out over my skis and say that from a queer perspective, being apolitical is a luxury and privilege of the majority. I don't think, I'd almost say there isn't such a thing in terms of like queer identities. If you're saying, oh, I'm being apolitical about this, you're kind of,
you're usually, I feel like if someone says they're apolitical about something, it means that they're quite happy with the situation as it stands, and they don't want to get involved in a difficult and uncomfortable discussion that will make them have to examine their own part in the complex, unfair structure of a capitalist world we live in. That would be my view.
There's a really interesting interview I read a few years ago with, I think it was the guy who created BoJack Horseman, and I now can't remember what his name is, but he was talking about constructing jokes for the show. And I don't know, they'd be like putting together a joke with like two like a couple standing at a bus stop, something, and I don't know, something happens to them, but like the joke required it to be a couple, and they would have discussions about the joke, and somebody would say, oh, well, could the couple be a lesbian couple? And like suddenly they were like, oh no, but that's like political. Like then the joke is about them being lesbians, and he was like, but why? Why do I think like that's not true, is it? And so they made a point of it throughout the show of being like very diverse, with even just like kind of background jokes and things, like the drive-by joke about the couple standing at the bus stop, because they were like, oh no, this is only political or apolitical because we deign it so. And if we refuse to engage on those terms, then it stops being so. So it's sort of it's a construct.
Yeah. Trip, did you want to come in? You were...
No, I was just sort of thinking, I've completely lost it. Yeah.
Well, here's a question, again, a follow-up. So I can't write anything with the intent to entertain. I think you can be political and be entertaining.
Yeah.
There's literally nothing stopping you from writing something with the intent to entertain. Like, the intent to entertain is a fantastic and wonderful impulse. I think, like, quite often when this sort of sentiment comes up, it's like, in the extreme cases, and I'm not saying that's the case here, it's like, well, it's just a harmless little joke. It's funny, it doesn't hurt anyone. But so the thing about humor is it often relies on surprise, and a good way to get surprise is to play on the things that everyone accepts as true or are socialized to be familiar with, and then you get something surprising. Because that's not the normal thing. This is one aspect behind why we love a pantomime dame, because quite often the person cast as a pantomime dame is someone who looks incredibly masculine, and so the surprise is the contrast. We're expecting someone who looks very masculine to dress in a very masculine way, to act a very masculine way, and then when they don't, the gap between expectation and reality sort of like provides the humor. I think the thing is, like, when you are using these pre-existing assumptions, you should question them. Like, why am I thinking this? And often you can get a more specific and funnier joke by going for something that's not as obvious.
Yeah. I think the other thing that I would say is that, like, going back to the joke about the lesbian couple at the bus stop, like you have like two options there, say, like, and this is a comedy show purely for entertainment, not trying to be political. One option is that you go for the mimetic representation of the world as it is, where most people are straight couples, say. Like, it's unchallenging. It's just like the default is, if you have a joke about a couple, it's a straight couple. That's completely unchallenging. That's apolitical as far as, like, you know, a lot of discourse would have it. That will make, if they're like if they're generally like white straight people, that will make, you know, people of color not feel included. That will make LGBT people not feel included. Like, you're presenting a view of the world which is like non-controversial because it's quite familiar to all of us, but that, like, certain people have been excluded from because the world excludes those people. This is why I say, like, if you don't make a choice, it's still a choice. If you represent the world as it is, you're still being political because the world is a political thing. So, like, those people who aren't included in that picture of the world will notice that they're not included. Conversely, if you go, no, I'm going for like radical inclusion, I'm always going to make sure that there are like background characters of color. I'm going to make sure that there are LGBT, etc., 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 differently abled characters, and so on. Then those characters will see themselves and be represented. From their perspective, you're now being apolitical. They're feeling included. That, you know, but all the people who sort of write angry comments on the internet going, why are there gay characters all over my television program? Why do you have to rub it in my face all the time? They now think you're being political. Yeah. So it's I think that the issue is that if you say, like, well, can I do something just for entertainment? Who are you entertaining? Who's the audience? And these things change. It's a continuum. It's relative.
Thank you.
And everything, like one of the wonderful things about how language works is, like, words come with associations. Words come with echoes and concepts and things. And that's one of the wonderful things about writing, is like finding those words and finding those associations and playing on them. But like the side effect of how language works is that those associations can come along when we use a certain term or phrase, whether we want them to or not. So it is difficult sometimes to write something purely for entertainment, because you cannot completely divorce a word from all of those associations that come with it. You can, once you write something, like, quite often it is up to whoever reads it to interpret how it reads, how it functions, what it actually says. Quite often, the book or story that you write is not the story or book that whoever reads it reads. They are two different entities entirely, and a lot of that comes down to what associations that person has had, what sort of life they've had, what sort of words they're familiar with. Like, there are some words that sound very similar to words that we don't consider acceptable anymore, and so those words themselves, like, some people will be fine with them, some people won't. Like, it's very, like, you can't predict everything. The system is too complex.
I was going to ask a question that Andy had asked, but actually I'm going to ask this one because I'm hoping the answer will just be a simple yes. So Kilishandra asks, as someone who's bi, I find the B in LGBTQ plus is often sidelined, forgotten, or dismissed. In your drive for good queer books, have you remembered the B?
We have not explicitly asked all of our authors to confirm all of their identities.
Fair. I think that's very fair.
Yeah. We have made a conscious effort to try and include as wide a diversity of stories as possible. I am comfortable in feeling that we have some bisexual stories, either in terms of the characters or the creators included in the anthology. But that's you try and be as inclusive as you can be, but you also have to balance demanding people reveal all of their intricacies to you.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, sorry, being very corporate, my response, my immediate internal thought to that is good challenge. Thanks. That's making me think. And is making me ponder like sort of like the nature of short stories, that like you see a snapshot of people's lives. It's like a single event normally. And if you have a romantic story, you're seeing one moment from one relationship, sort of. Yeah, like I can imagine that there are characters that like our authors might have conceived of as bi, that like are open to bi interpretations on the page, that aren't explicitly bi, because we're seeing them in a male moment or a female moment. But I think it does, there are interesting questions in there about, when you have characters thinking internally about, they look at somebody and they find them attractive, and like what you signal with that. And I didn't necessarily do all of my reading with that kind of a lens on. But I think I probably will now. So
it's really it was really interesting to hear you say about the snapshot, because when I read this question, as someone who is often like coded as straight because I'm married to a man, and Andy and I have been together since we were teenagers, and they don't necessarily know his identity, they don't know my identity, but that's just how we appear. He's very tall, I'm quite small, we just appear like that. That's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, it's so, without actually explicitly saying that someone's bi, sometimes it just gets lost. And maybe that's why, Kilishandra, you often find that B feels often sidelined, forgotten, or dismissed because of experiences like that, when people define you for what you're in right now and what they can see in front of them, rather than thinking about what's underneath the iceberg, I guess.
Yeah. And one thing I will offer, not an excuse, but often when you're writing something as an author, you know you're writing a bi character. It doesn't always occur to you that you have not made it explicit on the page. I run into this when editing my work very, very frequently, because I hold the entire world back in the back of my head, and I don't always realize, what do you mean I haven't explicitly said that, like, there is a clock in St. Pancras, and if you go up to the top at like 12:01, you can step between ticks of the clock and enter a parallel universe. Everyone knows that, right? That's just obvious. No. But because I know it, and because it's in my head, I don't always see what is or is not on the page. I will say the last time I wrote a bi character, I made a very deliberate effort in the very first chapter, when he was having a sort of like a male. He had an ex-boyfriend, but he was looking at a woman and appreciating her appearance. So we saw the male character look at the female character and express admiration, but at the same time remember, oh, my ex-boyfriend always did this, this, and this. She looks like she would do a similar sort of thing. And it can just be a line, it can be just a half line, but it can be really hard to remember to feed those details in, and to remember to check to make sure you've done it, because these characters do often exist in your head in their totality and in their complexity, but that doesn't always mean that these details get explicitly put on the page, particularly if you're writing something where romance isn't strongly forward. So it's not an excuse. It would be great to see those things sort of like threaded through more often and more visibly. But it is something that does occur, and it is a challenge to be aware of. Even if you are writing on your own, or you're thinking about writing your own thing, you think about creating your own world. Thinking about the sorts of details you can include in like sort of like passing mentions to make it explicit, because the thing is, people are going to assume the default if you don't make it explicit.
Yeah, like I'm not a big fan of the J.K. Rowling approach to defending her representation in her books by saying the word of the LGBTQ community, they were just not on the page. Or they were on the page, but I didn't specify, but they were there and I was inclusive. And I just think when someone ends up with such a broad reach, that doesn't really cut it in terms of, because for the young person that's reading that book, who's feeling alone, who's feeling that they're not represented in the media they're consuming, that helps them not one jot. So yeah.
And this is further complicated by the way in which we talk about representation in books, particularly if you're looking at like TikTok, sapphic, Achillean. These sort of terms are used quite frequently, and they are men loving men, they are women loving women, but like it encompasses, again, like Chris was saying, that moment, that story. This book is about this person this way. Achillean books can have bi, gay, queer, even trans male pairings, similar for sapphic books. But the language we use is based on those pairings. And there's not, to my knowledge, a similar term for sort of like bisexual pairings. And like Ursula Le Guin has gone into this again and again and again. If you don't have the language, it's very difficult to talk about these things. It's even sometimes difficult to conceive of these things until you have the word for it.
Yeah. In Wifrit, when we were writing, we made up some words that were similar, inspired by Bona, and the way that people talked in the world, if they were from that world's LGBTQ plus community. And it was really fun to do that, like, because there's a place in that world called Safri. So it was really fun, like, to think about Warhammer is like lots of puns based on the real world, so that was quite fun. But I want to come to this question, but just of that, I'm not getting that caught up. I seem to have frozen. Wouldn't the attempt to change a connotation of a term make an interesting story? I think it would. So Mark says, could you talk a bit about why you chose Pulp Fiction specifically for the anthology? I got a sneak peek of this from Trip last week. So
part of it was very deliberate reclamation. Like if you think about, say, detective noir as one of the classic modes of Pulp Fiction, which Chris is more versed in than I, a lot of Pulp Fiction has very gendered, very heteronormative assumptions that go into it. It is like adventure novels. These are stories of manly men's men that man across the manosphere and like conquer and do the man thing in the man way. And we wanted to deliberately undercut and reclaim that, because like Pulp Fiction's, it's flippin' fun. It is pacey. It is ridiculous. It is over the top. It is entertaining. It was written to entertain. So we wanted to we're like, like the queer existence. Let us have a chance to be ridiculous and to be over the top and to have fun with these like ridiculous core stories, but at the same time make it an act of overt reclamation. I don't know, Chris, do you have anything to add to that sort of like general?
Yeah, well, I think the thing is that like, yeah, I suppose like the step further I would take that is the fact that it always felt camp. It always feels camp. You're like, well, what? Why wasn't it gay? Look at the barbarians have these long, loving descriptions of their rippling muscles and torsos, and the villain has such a fantastic outfit and probably makeup, and like this is in that kind of weird way that like Disney deliberately kind of accidentally, as a result of the Hays Code, used queer archetypes to like code their villainy. Somebody just mentioned the Maltese Falcon in chat, and yeah, again, Hays Code. You sort of this kind of sense of these kind of elevated versions of storytelling have kind of like queerness baked into them for all sorts of reasons, many to do with prejudice, but they're never actually gay from the ground up. So I think to us it sort of felt obvious. We were kind of, again, sitting in the kitchen having the conversation, and there was an element of it that was like, surely this has been done. Surely this is blindingly obvious, and probably other people have done it, I'm sure, but like it was kind of like it was such a natural pairing. It almost didn't take very much justification in our heads, anyway.
No, and a really good example of that actually is the absolutely phenomenal cover art that Stephen Andrade did for us. Like if you go and you look at look at the anthology cover art, it is so incredibly pulpy, and it is camp. It is just, yeah, and they fit, they merge. It reinforces one another. Look at the cover. Do yourself a favor.
Again, in answering the comment, you kind of answered Kilishandra's question, so I just brought it up. What is the difference between pulp fiction and queer pulp fiction? It sounds like it's pulp fiction just with acknowledging the queerness that was always there in pulp fiction.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So on that note, we've reached the end. So absolutely fun for a really fascinating and interesting discussion. We wish you, sorry, my connection's being really weird right at the end here. So I'm sure everyone in the chat also wishes you all the best with the anthology. As I said, I've put the links in, so everyone please do check it out and pre-order, and do make sure that you go out and get Trip's book, because I have it on good authority that it's excellent. So thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been a pleasure to meet you again, Trip, and to meet you for the first time, Chris.
Thank you for having us. I've got my Norma Desmond moment going on right here. Apparently, I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille. But yeah, no, thank you so much for having us. We absolutely love talking about these sorts of things at length. So
never stuck for opinions, anyway.
This is the grand finale of Inside the Rookery for this season. We have celebrated Pride Month. This is the last one in June. We'll be back in July. We're just doing the program for next season. So please do join us on Discord or the Patreon and let us know what you'd like to see next time. But until then, I will say good night and caw-caw, caw-caw. See you soon.